All right. Great to see some familiar faces and names. Really, really appreciate all of you being here tonight. I think we'll go ahead and get started, and others can join on as we move along. So I just want to say welcome everyone to our webinar this evening to celebrate the 40th anniversary of the Frank Church River of No Return Wilderness Area, hosted by the Idaho chapter of the Sierra Club. I'm Lisa Young. I use she, her pronouns. I'm the new director for the Idaho chapter Sierra Club. I'm really excited to be here with so many of you tonight, and I particularly want to thank our staff and volunteers who helped pull this together. So I want to thank Eric Willitson, our Conservation Program Manager, our volunteer leaders, Edwina Allen, former longtime chair of the chapter, Courtney White, who's our new chair of the chapter, Jenna Duffin, Middle Snake Group Chair, Connor Jackson, Outings Leader, along with our honorary guest speakers, U.S. Representative Larry LaRocco, and Dr. Ralph Mon, excuse me. I also want to thank the Frank Church Institute for letting us use this beautiful anniversary poster for this event and helping us get the word out. And I want you all to know that you can purchase this poster and get it sent right to your house for only $25. And that donation is going to go towards creating an oral history of the Frank Church Wilderness. If you click on the link that I'm hoping can be dropped into the chat here in a moment, you can go to the Frank Church Institute webpage and read more about that particular project and have an opportunity to purchase the poster and donate to that cause. So to give us some context for the webinar today, it was 40 years ago today, in 1980, that President Jimmy Carter signed into law the Central Idaho Wilderness Act that officially preserved the River of No Return Wilderness Area in Idaho, which was renamed just a few years later to include Senator Frank Church's name, who was Idaho's U.S. Senator who led the charge on the effort in Congress at the time. This wilderness area remains the largest contiguous federally protected area in the lower 48 at 3.2 million acres in the heart of Idaho, encompassing several majestic mountain ranges and fierce rivers that draw admiration and enjoyment from people across the nation. This area truly is the crown jewel of America's wilderness system. And I'm sure many of you are on this webinar right now who have spent time in the Frank would certainly agree. However, many of us don't know the history of how the Frank Church River of No Return Wilderness came to be. And it's easy to take for granted that we have this beautiful and vast space in our backyards, but it was a struggle to secure its preservation between logging and mining interests, conservationists, recreationists, local communities, and more. And we're going to hear from our speakers tonight about how that struggle played out, from Frank Church's political offices to grassroots activist groups, including the Idaho Sierra Club at the time, which was then the Northern Rockies chapter. And public land conservation is in many ways the heart of our work at Sierra Club. For those who aren't familiar, the Sierra Club, which was founded in 1892, is the nation's largest and most influential grassroots environmental organization with more than 2 million members and supporters. The Sierra Club has been successful in helping pass the Clean Air Act, the Clean Water Act, the Endangered Species Act, and protecting millions of acres of wilderness. The Idaho chapter is one of 64 Sierra Club chapters nationwide. Our conservation work here in Idaho began in the 1970s with the goal of securing permanent protection for the vast wildlands of Idaho. Historically, we focused on protecting wildlands and endangered species like grizzlies, wolves, and salmon that live there. And we helped advance wilderness protection for the Frank Church, Owyhee Canyonlands, and most recently the Boulder White Clouds in 2015. In recent years, we realized just drawing boundaries around areas would not secure them from the effects of climate change. So Sierra Club is leading the charge to move away from dirty fossil fuels that cause climate disruption and toward a clean energy economy. This is a global problem, but the good news is that locally we can take actions that add up and make a real difference. So beyond our traditional conservation partners, we're working to build alliances with people from the faith community, businesses, and people from all racial and economic backgrounds. We stand in solidarity with movements for social justice and believe everyone has a voice and role to play in moving our state and communities to a carbon-free energy future and protecting the Idaho that we love. And on that note, I do want to first acknowledge that the Frank Church River of No Return Wilderness Area encompasses the ancestral lands of the Shoshone, Bannock, Tukadeka, and Nez Perce Nimipu people, who lived off those lands and rivers for centuries before European settlers arrived and began decimating the land and people and displacing the tribes who called that place home. So this is an important piece of the history of the land, which we're not going to cover in today's talks, but that we must keep in our minds as we learn about the history of the sacred place and its significance for so many. We're currently collaborating with both tribes on regional salmon and steelhead recovery efforts, which we'll be talking about later in the webinar, including ways for you to take action on that. So let's see, next slide, please, Eric. And as far as the agenda for the webinar tonight, we'll first be hearing from our two guest speakers. Then we'll have a Q&A, which we'll use the chat box for, and I'll explain that in a moment. And then we'll be hearing a few stories from people who signed up to share some of their special experiences in the Frank, and we will close out by 8 p.m. And let's see, next slide, please, Eric. And we will be utilizing the Zoom chat box during the Q&A portion of the webinar. So you can open the chat box by clicking at the bottom of your Zoom window on the chat icon, which will pull up the chat box on the right side of your screen. And then you can type into the very bottom to start typing into the chat box, which everyone can then see. We encourage you to add comments or questions throughout the webinar at any time using the chat, but particularly during the Q&A and storytelling portions. So please keep yourself muted throughout, since we want to reduce background noise. And then just with so many people, we won't be able to field questions orally, just through the chat box. And next slide, please. So with that, I want to introduce tonight's speakers by first acknowledging the man of the hour, Senator Frank Church, who this wilderness area is named after. This is the man that many people, of course, think of as the champion of securing this wilderness area, whom we owe so much gratitude and reverence for how hard he fought in the halls of power to protect this area for future generations to enjoy. But there were many other people in his office and on the ground who helped make this happen as well. And we have two of those people joining us to share those stories tonight. Next slide, please. So first, we'll hear from U.S. Representative Larry LaRocco. So Larry LaRocco was elected to 2 terms as U.S. Representative from Idaho's 1st District, where he served on the House Banking and Interior Committees. While in Congress, he introduced and passed legislation creating the Snake River Birds of Prey National Conservation Area. Previously, he was the North Idaho Field Director for Senator Church. He's a past president and board member of the U.S. Association of Former Members of Congress. He's a graduate of the University of Portland and Boston University and studied at Johns Hopkins University School of Advanced International Studies. And he served in the U.S. Army from 1969 to 72 in military intelligence, attaining the rank of captain. He and his wife, Chris, live in Boise. And next slide. Then we'll hear from Dr. Ralph Maughan. Dr. Maughan was a political science professor at ISU. His considerable conservation advocacy includes being a co-founder of the Idaho chapter of Sierra Club, Northern Rockies at the time, the Greater Yellowstone Coalition, Western Watersheds Project, and the Wolf Recovery Foundation. He was the chair of the Idaho chapter Sierra Club for 10 years. Ralph and his wife, Jackie Johnson Maughan, have authored a series of Idaho hiking books, including Hiking Idaho and Hiking Idaho's Sawtooth Country, which I'm sure many of you have on your shelves. He's an excellent photographer and writes a blog called The Wildlife News. He helped draw some of the southeastern boundaries of the Frank Church Wilderness Area and wrote a book about the struggle for the Frank with the provocative title, Charles Manson Was an Environmentalist, which has a really interesting backstory relating to the tension between loggers and environmentalists in the designation of the wilderness area. So
can I interrupt real quick?
Yes.
Is anyone seeing the shared screen anymore? So Eric, the person who was hosting our session, just lost power at his house. So I am going to attempt to share it from my screen. So please bear with me a moment, and sorry for this inconvenience.
Thanks so much, Jenna. We have to do this stuff sometimes. I can't believe he lost power. Maybe I'll lose power. Maybe we'll all, let's all hang in there. Send good, happy thoughts. And Jenna, sometimes it helps to push present first and then share your screen. Sometimes that can be a problem, but maybe you've got this. We'll see. Thanks for bearing with us, everybody.
Can we see the screen?
Yeah.
Okay, what slide are we on?
So we were just talking about Ralph. Did we get to see the other screens for people?
Yeah, that's the little book I wrote on Charles Manson, environmentalist. That, well, it went by pretty fast. That one, yeah. Mm-hmm.
Excellent, excellent. So yeah, I wanted to make sure everyone saw those. Sorry, I wasn't looking at the screen here. I'm not sure what was missed. So thanks, Jenna, for jumping in and getting us back on track. So there's a bit about Dr. Ralph Maughan. So let's see here. With that, I am, Jenna, if you can go to the next slide. And with that, I am going to pass it over to U.S. Representative Larry LaRocco to share his stories on the history behind the Frank Church River of No Return Wilderness. So over to you, Larry.
Okay. Lisa, can you hear me? Am I unmuted and all of that?
Yes, you're
Okay,
good.
great. First of all, thank you so much to the Sierra Club, the Idaho chapter, for putting on this wonderful event. Thinking about, today is the day 40 years ago that it was actually signed into law. What a timely and gathering that we're having here. I also want to thank you, the Sierra Club, personally for the endorsements that I got when I ran for office. I can remember conversations with Edwina where she'd say, you can announce that you got the endorsement or not announce it. I always used to say, I'm proud of the Sierra Club endorsement. And so it's just a delight to be with you. And I see some former church staffers that have also joined us. I want to say about this in the opening that because of the Sierra Club's involvement and the way that you organize and the way that you lobby and the way that you advocate for the public lands, this is a perfect example of how this was a homegrown effort. You had people like Ralph, and he'll explain his role and so forth, but we had the icons like Ernie Day and Ted Trueblood and Mort Brigham, and then the good work of Doug Scott and Dennis Baird and so forth. But the Sierra Club is a club that gets on the ground. They understand the resources, they understand the landscape, and they understand all of the conflicts and the various stakeholders. That's one of the hallmarks of what you do. But that's exactly what Ernie and Ted did, and what Ralph did, and the other advocates for the Central Idaho Wilderness did. They knew exactly where those lines should be drawn. They knew where the hydrologic divides were. They knew what was needed to protect the rivers. And I like to say in Congress, whenever you're advancing anything, you need a champion. Nothing gets done in Congress without a champion, because somebody's got to introduce that bill, and somebody's got to fight with their chairman to have hearings, and both at the subcommittee level and the full committee hearing level. And then they're generally in just one chamber of the Congress. In this case, it was Frank Church. And we do know that Frank Church's role in the Wilderness Act, where he was the floor manager for that, and the Wild and Scenic Rivers Act, and his work on Hell's Canyon, the Land and Water Conservation Fund, and so forth. So he was well suited because he loved the wilderness, and he had a concept of what this wilderness meant, not only to Idaho, but what it meant to the country. So he was the perfect champion. If I were to sort of characterize my remarks tonight, it would be about the perfect storm both for passing the bill and the perfect storm of what I would call political peril for Frank Church. As many of you know, Frank Church was the champion for the Gospel Hump Wilderness in '79 as part of the American Endangered Wilderness Act. And that was sort of a tune-up for this. I was fortunate enough to work in North Idaho for Frank Church, and I remember going to a meeting with Louise Shattuck, who was running the timber organization in Northern Idaho, and we had a big meeting in Grangeville, and boy, I tell you, it was hot. The chamber really wanted to log desperately, and the lower elevations there, and the Sierra Club wanted the Gospel Hump Wilderness. They saw the vision for that. So Louise Shattuck convinced Frank Church that he should get in the middle of that fight. And he agreed to that. And then he turned to me and he said, Larry, he said, I want to hand this over to you. You're on the ground mediating this thing. And so a year and a half later, we got the bill done. And it was just a delight to work with Doug Scott and Dennis Baird, and also the honorable people with the chamber that kept their deal. But that was a tune-up. And Frank Church knew that he had to do this. I don't know, he was a savvy politician, and he knew that this had to get done. Frank Church was under attack in the late '70s by, we saw the emergence of the independent expenditures, the NICPAC, Terry Dolan, and others. And Frank Church was also involved with the Panama Canal treaties. And you might ask, well, what does that have to do with the River of No Return wilderness? Well, he was essentially the champion for the Panama Canal treaties, and that was eroding his support as well. And so to take on a wilderness bill where all of the shibboleths and the arguments against wilderness were being proffered by people like Steve Sims, who were saying that, it was going to decimate the timber industry and the mining industry and the cattle industry and everybody else. And nobody could get into the wilderness area, and they never mentioned fish. So, but Frank Church, based on his philosophy about what this meant for future generations, took it on. And then the lines that were drawn were scientific in a sense, that this area should be 2.3 million acres. It shouldn't be 2.18 million acres. It needs to be exactly what it is. Because as Rick Johnson is fond of saying, this is protecting the highest elevation spawning grounds for salmon and steelhead in the world. And so degrading the water by allowing extraction activities in this area would degrade that. And that's what Frank Church wanted to do. So the perfect storm was that the Democrats controlled the Senate and the House and the White House. Luckily for us, Cecil Andrus was also in the cabinet at the time as Secretary of the Interior, and he took President Carter down the middle fork so he could tell him the importance of it. That was the perfect storm. But Frank Church had the courage to move forward. He didn't say, hey, no, I can't do this. Let's do this in 81. Let's do it when it's safe. Let's do this when I get reelected. Then I'll have more time to devote to this. He jumped into this with both feet. And I will credit him for the rest of my life. And I think we should all credit him with having the courage to do that. It just takes a great deal of political strength to do that. And we all know what would have happened if he had not acted. Steve Sims won the election, who doesn't believe in wilderness. Ronald Reagan became president, who has actually vetoed wilderness bills in Montana, for example, that passed both the House and the Senate. He vetoed those bills. And so this wouldn't have happened. We wouldn't have had essentially this magnificent area that has meant so much to Idaho. So what I was involved in North Idaho, I spent more time in Elk City than I care to admit, because there was a Save Elk City group there, and it was all about Meadow Creek. It was all about Meadow Creek, which is a magnificent landscape, which is still protected. And actually, I put it into my wilderness bill in 1993. And it's my hope that we never get close to logging in that area, because it's a magnificent area. It didn't go into the wilderness, but it's been protected since. And we know what has happened to some of the mills there because of automation and overcutting in some of the forests. But Frank Church moved this forward. It was bipartisan. At the Frank Church Institute, we like to talk about democracy and how it will survive and thrive in the 21st century. We use this bill as an example of democracy at work because it was bipartisan. And thank God for John Seiberling in the House, who took Frank Church's lead on this and moved the bill forward. I also want to make the point that we need to celebrate this and talk about it. People don't understand what it means to have courage to do things like this. Some people may think that it happens with the stroke of a pen, that it happens under the Antiquities Act, or that it's always been a wilderness area. It wasn't. It was created and secured and protected by a politician who believed in the future of our country and knew and thought, like the Native Americans, that we should protect this for 7 generations. So we need to talk about how this process works. And we need to remind people that don't know Frank Church and why it's named the Frank. I want to give a shout out to Senator McClure, who did the right thing in 1984 and passed legislation to name this wonderful area after Frank Church. Frank Church never wanted a post office named after him. Believe me, he never wanted a post office. But the highest honor for him was to have this magnificent landscape, this wilderness that he created through legislation named after him. It meant a lot to him on his deathbed, and I'll always be very proud of Senator McClure for doing that. These are just some thoughts that I wanted to share. I think we need to think about the courage of a man like this, and somebody that didn't put it off and did the right thing for the country and for us here in Idaho.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Larry, for those words and that reminder. Really appreciate that. And I'll pass it on over to Dr. Ralph Maughan now to share his side of the story from the time when the Frank Church Wilderness was being designated. And Jenna, if we can pull the screen back up, or the slideshow, which I believe we have of some of Ralph's amazing photos from the Frank. So go ahead, Ralph.
Okay, Lisa, could you let me know when I have about 2 minutes left?
Sure, will do.
Okay, I grew up in Idaho and Utah, but I came back because I missed the outdoors. I lived in the Midwest for a while, and I came back because I missed the outdoors, and I worked very hard on the effort to protect the White Clouds from an open pit mine. I worked on the Teton Dam, which eventually, I guess we won. It collapsed and drowned a whole bunch of people. And I knew that something was coming up. There was a really big thing that the Idaho primitive areas, it was called, needed to be reclassified or declassified because the Wilderness Act, which had passed in 1964, mandated that all primitive areas had to be reviewed, and then Congress needed to make a decision as to whether they're going to be wilderness or not in the future. And so people were talking about the reclassification of the Idaho primitive area to wilderness a number of years beforehand, even before the White Clouds and the Sawtooth Wilderness were completed. And so I was one of those. And the biggest thing about the Idaho primitive area was that it was the biggest primitive area in the country, I believe, but it only captured about half of the pristine or roadless land that was in the area. The rest of it, I think the idea was just originally there is so much wilderness and primitive land here that we don't have to do very much about it. We'll just carve out kind of the center, and that'll be the primitive area. Later on, we'll make it a wilderness area, and that will take care of things. But the conservationists I knew, and after I'd been here about 10 years, I knew most of them in Idaho, except for some of them in northern Idaho. They wanted to add these roadless areas. And that was the thing that I worked the hardest on. And I won't go into talk about each roadless area. These slides show some of the roadless areas that you're seeing. But I wanted to see as much of this roadless land added as I possibly could. And the great thing about this bill was they were all added. 1.4 or 3, I think it was, million acres, or maybe it was 1.2 million acres of the primitive area grew to 2.3 million acres. It wasn't really a compromise. Conservationists asked for something and they got something, and it shows that it can be done. Now, I should say something about the political environment of the 1970s, and Congressman LaRocca already has, but that was a very good time for protecting the environment. Almost all of the environmental laws, the Clean Air Act, the Clean Water Act, the Noise Pollution Act, all of these were passed in the 1970s, and it was also a good time for designating wilderness. And there was a lot of it designated in Idaho in the 1970s. There was a Sawtooth Wilderness, there was the River of No Return Wilderness, there was the Gospel Hump Wilderness. They were all designated in the 1970s. In Idaho, there hasn't been very much since, except for, of course, the Boulder White Clouds. And I kind of really bit my teeth when it came to forest policy on the Frank Church Wilderness or the River of No Return Wilderness, because I learned that designating wilderness or simply protecting forest land will be said to be an economic issue, but it's really not. It's a cultural issue. It's to keep these little towns that have been dependent on it going. And so they basically are having their, we're having their way of life subsidized. But it cost the rest of us money, and we not only lost money, much more important, we lost a lot of very important land to not only people in Idaho, but to the entire world. And so from then on, I used economic issues, but I learned more and more it was really a cultural issue. And I'm surprised it took so many of us so long to learn that. And today, and we look at the Trump administration, the whole thing is a cultural issue. Sometimes they'll talk about the economy and other things, but it's a cultural issue. And I think some of the start of this backwards type of thought, this mean type of thought, started when it came to designating wilderness and other land conservation issues, where you never could compromise. You had either win or lose, because they would not compromise. They were not impressed if you gave up something. And so I learned an awful lot, and I went on, and I did a lot of things with the Sierra Club. And what I want to say about the Sierra Club is I wore a lot of hats. The Sierra Club, some of the time, other times the River of No Return Wilderness Council, the Idaho Environmental Council, the Greater Yellowstone Coalition, and the Western Watersheds Project. But the most important thing about any of this was the Sierra Club was almost always there in the background. And so I might have gone back to Washington and said, I'm testifying for a certain group in Idaho, but you can bet the plane ticket was bought by the Sierra Club. About a few years after the River of No Return Wilderness, I felt there was a need to and a possibility of protecting much more of the Yellowstone Park area, the Greater Yellowstone area. But how was I supposed to get this started? I had a sabbatical leave at the university, but that wasn't enough. And so I asked the Sierra Club, and Edwina Allen saw to it that I got a grant to finance a part of my way in what became organized as the Greater Yellowstone Coalition, which today is a very large organization and is certainly doing fine, thank you, as far as finances go. But I don't think there would have been a Greater Yellowstone Coalition if it wasn't for the Sierra Club. And there'd be so many things around the country, and especially in Idaho, that we would not have if it wasn't for the Sierra Club. So if you look at something that's been conserved and you wonder, how did this happen? Was there a fight over this? You can almost certainly say there was, and you can almost certainly say the Sierra Club had a hand in this. Thank you.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Ralph. You're right on time. And those stories were really, really fun to hear, particularly about the Sierra Club's history. Thank you. Thank you both so much for sharing these stories and detailing the history of the political struggle behind the Frank Church River of No Return Wilderness area. We've got a few questions now for both of you, from both the organizers of the event and the audience. So as a reminder for audience members, if you have a question to ask either speaker, please just put it in the chat. You can just type it right into the chat box, and we will have a team kind of collating those and going over them and getting them to me as the moderator to ask the speakers. So let me kind of take a look at where we are right now. One thing I actually just wanted to ask you as a quick follow-up, Ralph, if you can explain the title of your book. That Charles Manson is an environmentalist, and how that's related to the history behind the Frank Church Wilderness.
When we went to the public hearing in Salmon, we went up the day before, and when we got there was a big logging truck right next to the highway and almost adjacent to where the hearing would be held. And on it, it was filled up with tiny little logs, which was supposed to impress us, I guess, with the productive capabilities of the area. But there was also a big sign that said Charles Manson was an environmentalist. And then the hearings were held the next day, and they were pretty unpleasant hearings. They were more like something we'd have nowadays. but I felt that it was significant enough to write a book about that. And so that's where the name came from. Charles Manson was an environmentalist. Well, I don't think so, but we remembered that, and we showed him what real environmentalism was there. And of course, we had a lot of support from Salmon too. I shouldn't give the impression it's a town filled with nothing but loggers.
Thank you. Thanks, Ralph. I remember you saying that during some of those tense hearings that Senator Church had to wear a bulletproof vest. Is that right?
That's what I was told when I was writing the aforementioned book. I don't know if it was an aide of the senators or who it was, but I was talking about it, and he said, you know, Senator Church wore bulletproof vests that day. And I said, really? And then I was told that's the only time he ever wore one. I don't know, Larry, you might know something about that, but
I don't think he did, Ralph. It just wouldn't be his style, you know. Those hearings were pretty rough, though. I think the Salmon hearing is when somebody rode a horse into the courthouse there, or into the room, and Bethine was asked by a reporter, "So what'd you think of that?" And she said, "Mighty fine horse." And you know, she was pretty cool about it too. I can tell you that when we did the rollout of the proposal in Grangeville at the Elks Club for the Gospel Hump Wilderness, Frank Church was hanging in effigy on a flatbed truck. And the sheriff did offer me a bulletproof vest, and I declined at that time, but it was pretty hot. And Steve Sims had really stirred the pot there with the locals.
Wow.
So this was not beanbag stuff, and people were you know, worked up.
Wow. Wow. I can just kind of picture it and feel it. Wow. Very interesting. We have a question here asking if you can tell the story of how the wilderness boundary was drawn down Bear Valley Creek and Ayers Meadow and how those became wilderness. Can either of you speak?
yeah. Forest Service said, well, there are two fine meadows and fine stream, and the Forest Service in what was called the Roadless Area Review process had recommended they become staging areas, as they called them, for campgrounds and people with RVs and everything, so they could drive down to Dagger Falls and put into the Middle Fork of the Salmon. So it's going to be a noisy sort of thing. And the beauty of these meadows, and even more important than the beauty, is the wildlife habitat was going to be destroyed. So when I went back to Washington, one of the times, so there was a time when they marked up the bill, actually, which is the word they use in Congress for when they actually take the bill as it was printed and start crossing things out and writing new things in, changing figures and so forth. And I was in the room with a congressional aide. I think he's in fact the chief counsel or something like that for the Public Lands Subcommittee of the House Interior Committee. His name was Andy Wiesner. I'm sure you knew him, Larry. And I told him what the future was for these areas. I said, I don't know, because we were adding a lot of stuff, he and I, to the bill. And it was great. I thought it was wonderful. This is the way it works in Washington. I want to come back here more. But
Yeah.
we got to
Let me
those.
add to that, if I may, Ralph, there was a time when the senator and Bethine were in Lewiston, and Dennis Baird and Mort Brigham needed to talk to him about an area called Hell's Half Acre. And we were in a motel room, and Mort and Dennis had these maps out on this bed in this motel room, and Church and Bethine are poring over the maps on where the line should go, and Mort was making the case on why it needed to be included, and adding that area, you know, put more acres into it, which, you know, politically, you know, you wanted to have a satisfactory number, or one that was absorbed by the public, but Church didn't care. If it needed to go in because of watershed, habitat, you know, wildlife corridors, or special species, he was all for it, and he did not back down.
I think Andy Wiesner was of the same mind on this. And I told him the Forest Service really didn't want to have this in, and so maybe we ought not to add these 2 meadows. And he said, well, I know what we can do about that. And he took his marker and he ran it right down the side of the road and put 100-foot, or maybe it's only a 50-foot corridor all the way from the meadows down into the Middle Fork Canyon to Dagger Falls. And I thought, oh, this is just wonderful. And I think if it hadn't have been for what we did, and certainly it had to pass the approval of Senator Church and other people, but I think we added about 500,000 acres of a roadless area on the south and southeast side of the Idaho primitive area.
Wow. Wow, I think that really speaks to the importance in these campaigns of involving folks from all different parts of the state that have, those different geographic perspectives on some of these wilderness areas, and ensuring that we have all those voices in the room. Thank you, Ralph, for helping to add all that area on the southeast side of it.
I should say I was glad I was there to speak for Southeast Idaho, because I found out that people in Idaho have different perceptions of the central Idaho wildernesses depending on where they live. People in northern Idaho see it a lot different than those in Pocatello. To get from Pocatello up to Grangeville, which is where you'd want to go if you want to get into the westernmost part of the area, it's like driving almost to Los Angeles as far as distance goes. And so people in northern Idaho, of course, were a lot more interested in those areas, and Dennis Baird advocating for them. And then it was people in Boise had another set of agenda, and I could speak for people in southeast Idaho for these areas around Chalice and Stanley, which were not quite so well known, especially when they were kind of in the shadows compared to the Sawtooth Mountains.
No.
And I just want to say, you can see why we're going to have Ralph be part of the oral histories for this. This is when we're going to get Ralph, and we're going to interview him for hours and hours and talk about this stuff so that we've got it all on tape. And that's part of the deal we're doing with the posters, Lisa. So thanks for the shout out on the poster.
Definitely. I know. No, yes. Let's get hours and hours of Ralph talk. Yeah, truly. We like you said, we need that. And as for the archives, and then just for all of us to enjoy. And as a reminder, that the link to buy the Frank Church poster and contribute to that oral history project is in the chat. You can see that Jenna posted that earlier. Another question that came through, and maybe we can start with you, Larry. What was the most, and you've both spoken to this a little bit, but in your opinion, what was the most important component to getting this wilderness area designated at the time? Was it Frank Church's personality? Was it the political climate at the time? Something else? What was the most important thing?
I think it was Frank Church's leadership. I think he just embraced this, and he said, I'm going to do this. We're going to do this. He had the relationship with Andrus, of course, and the administration, with Cyberling in the House, and Cyberling had Andy Wiesner, who was a great staff member, but Church embraced this. And I think sometimes, people might say, hey, do you want to hold back? And he said, no, it's full steam ahead. We're going to do this. So it's just that tenacity and sense of purpose and having the vision. If you look at the debate on the floor of the Senate, and I didn't mention this, but I was sitting behind Church on the floor of the Senate when it passed the Senate. And it was a great day in my life to be there with him. I mean, and he asked me to come from Idaho to be with him. And but if you look at that debate, and you see the challenges that were made to him, and they were procedural, they were parliamentary, they were sort of trick questions on timber volume and all this. And Church knocked every question out of the park. And here's this guy who's chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee on the floor talking about wilderness public lands issues, and almost without a note. I mean, it was sort of the combination of his determination, his vision, and his brilliance that this could happen. Because Hayakawa, if you look at the record, had some crazy amendments they were offering, and he was able to parry that. McLaurin, he went back and forth on some stuff on mining and the deals that were made, and it got a little tense. But he was right there, and he was a great orator. He was probably one of the smartest people I've ever met in my life, but he had the commitment to this goal, and he understood the value. And the other component that I think drove it, in terms of the formation of the bill, let's just think about it, is water. It's water quality, and that's what he protected, and that's why the wilderness is the size it is.
Thanks so much, Larry. And Ralph, you want to answer that question? What do you think was one of the most important things of getting this past the finish line?
Most important thing that President Carter did, was that the question?
No, just in terms of designating the wilderness area, what do you think was one of the most important things that helped get it past the finish line? We have someone asked the question here, was it Frank Church's personality? Was it the political landscape? What was it that helped actually make this happen?
Well, if Frank Church had not been the senator, it simply would not have happened. We might have got a very small wilderness area. We might not have got one at all. It might still be sitting there as the Idaho Primitive Area. So it just wouldn't have happened without Frank Church, and it's just fitting that his name should be in there, and we should affectionately call it the Frank. As far as conservationists went, there wasn't a lot of infighting that I saw. I thought we were pretty unified, and we were well prepared. We knew our stuff on this. I think we kind of matured on this compared to some of the other actions. We were learning as a movement.
Yeah, right.
Lisa, I'll just add how important that component is, because after the River of No Return wilderness was passed, we still had over 9 million acres of roadless lands, and most of them have wilderness qualities. So there was an effort by Andrus and McClure actually to resolve that issue. And so these two guys, in a bipartisan way, couldn't forge a deal. So that's how hard it is to do that. I mean, we have had the Owyhee Canyon lands, which is bubbled up from the local area, and we've had the Boulder White Clouds, which was sort of always percolating, but it's just very difficult to do this in Idaho, and he did it.
Awesome. Well, one of the next questions that we have is about salmon. The question is, what happened to the wild salmon industry? We used to enjoy all this wild salmon. What happened? Do either of you have insights on that?
Let's see. I've got a thought about this, Lisa, if I might add. When we were celebrating the issuance of the Frank Church River of No Return Wilderness Quarter in salmon in October, Mike Simpson was there. He spoke eloquently about Frank Church's role in the creation of the River of No Return Wilderness. And I think we all know that he's pretty riveted on the salmon issue. And I think that he credits Church with working to preserve that area. I think he has a real sense of the value of wilderness for the country and for himself and for our state. But he understands the pristine nature of that water and the high elevation spawning grounds. And I think he's asking all the right questions now on this particular issue. And I think that hasn't been done. I mean, I tried a salmon recovery group in 1993, and the interest in Lewiston, through crowbars and the spokes of my bicycle every chance they got on that deal. But now Simpson's coming along, and he's asking the right questions, and he's just tenacious on this. And I think being actually in the minority gives him a chance to work with the Democrats to get this done. And we'll have to see what he does. But I think it's looking more promising. And people like Pat Ford and Rick Johnson that have spent their lives on this, and Ralph and others. I mean, there's, I saw Don Crawford on the call. I mean, there's so many people now who are working on salmon, just like they worked to pass the River of No Return. And that makes me smile to see this intensity and to have somebody like Mike Simpson, who I think is really intent on doing something.
Great. Thanks so much, Larry. And yeah, we will be talking a bit more about kind of the current salmon recovery campaign that we're working on in just a moment. And I'll just add that someone here in the chat added the comment that the Frank still provides essential core habitat for all the species that were there when Lewis and Clark passed through Idaho in 1804, except for one, grizzlies. It is one of the few locations in the entire Columbia River Basin that still supports wild native salmon and steelhead. So that was a comment from someone else here. And Ralph, if you want to add anything about the salmon, we've got some other questions as well. Up to you.
Let's go on to another question.
Sure, no problem. So one question that we have here was, how was President Carter involved? What kind of credit does he get?
Well, I think Larry might know a lot better than me, but I know that he was friendly to conservation issues of all kinds, including wilderness. I do believe he floated down the Middle Fork of the Salmon as well. And the one thing I should want to say about him is we need somebody that said he'll never tell a lie and probably didn't. And we had him at that time.
I think he deserves a lot of credit, and I think he listened to the right guy in his administration, and that was Cecil Andrus. And let's be clear about Cecil Andrus's role in the Alaska Lands Bill, which was huge, and that wouldn't have happened without an environmental ethic by Carter. And I can't recite all the names of the people that he had as deputy assistant secretaries in the Department of Agriculture, but he had Cecil Andrus there, who was a hook and bullet guy, and he knew the value of wilderness. He and Church got along great. So that's part of the perfect storm. And Church was building up chits, by the way, because Carter turned over the Panama Canal treaties to Church, and that was not a pleasant task, I can tell you. I was on the ground listening to people talk about that giveaway, and then he took on the River of No Return wilderness. So he had a lot of credibility built up with that administration, and so it was a
Wow.
wonderful conclusion.
Right. Wow. Well, another question that we have here is, what is your favorite memory of the Frank campaign? And maybe we'll start with you, Ralph.
Well, it was the hearings of salmon, which I talk about in my book, but that's the most prominent ones that I always think of. The rest of them is various trips and so forth, and I won't comment on those.
Yeah, I agree. I think the hearings were just wonderful Idaho events. I mean, they were rough and tumble, but remember Bethine Church was the daughter of a governor, and Frank Church grew up as a young guy, and this was, as it turned out, unfortunately the end of his career, but it wasn't his first rodeo, so to speak, and he knew how to handle that, and he never lost his cool. People charged him with putting jobs in jeopardy and so forth, in timber dependent communities and the like, but he held fast. And let's remember, there were some compromises made, not in the boundaries, but they were made in allowing jet boats on the main salmon, and also preserving the land, what I want to say, the backcountry land airstrips. And so now people can fly into the backcountry. It's legitimate, it's legal. And those were some compromises, but there weren't compromises on the water quality and any jeopardy to those species. And on the grizzly bear issue, we know that they're sort of moved into the Selway Bitterroot, and that's where they are now. It's sort of a management issue as well.
Right. No, thanks for lifting that up. We have one more question here, and then we might be wrapping up if anyone wants to get your last minute questions in, but we're kind of at the top of the hour here. But one other question is, what risks to the future integrity of the Frank might we look out for? What are risks to the area that maybe are still on the horizon?
I'd like to just say that every piece of legislation that has ever passed is amendable. This was created by legislation. Ralph mentioned the maps that were drawn. If you look into the history of this legislation, there's language and there are maps. And it just scares me to think of where some of this is going with some of the elements in politics right now. If there was a different type of ideological leadership, there were actually attempts by Steve Sims to change the boundaries in Hell's Canyon. So this is not unprecedented that people would take the map out and use the famous Sharpie that the president has used and try and change that. So you just turn this perfect storm around and things could get done in a different way. And so I think we need to be vigilant about that. That's why these forums are so important, Lisa, what you're doing tonight, because we get together, we talk about the values, we talk about the history, the people, and then we get energized to make sure that there is no deterioration. But a piece of legislation passed this, and it's amendable.
Yeah, good point.
That's a danger.
Well, yeah, well said. What about you, Ralph?
Yes, I would agree with Larry about threats from the general political situation. There are a few things that bear watching, though, that are not new. Existing mineral rights are supposed to be honored in this piece of legislation, as well as the original Wilderness Act. And there have been frequent little exploration measures on the west side of the wilderness. And I'm not sure exactly what the result was of the most recent ones and if they cleaned it up or not. But we have to watch those things. And then also there was one roadless area, beautiful, pristine roadless area adjacent to the Frank called Clear Creek, or maybe Panther Creek, depending on how you saw it. But it has perhaps cobalt in it. And that has to be protected. And yet the law said that this is not just part of the River of No Return Wilderness, it's a minerals management zone where mining is the, quote, dominant use. And so it would seem like if they want to develop a cobalt mine or maybe any kind of mine there, they can just go in and do it. Although their efforts so far, ironically, have resulted in improved water quality in Clear Creek and Blackbird Creek, because not because of the Wilderness Act, but because of water quality measures by the state of Idaho, I believe. They needed to clean up some of the old mine pollution that was running in from the old Blackbird mine way back in the day, back in the 1940s, I guess it was.
Wow.
So worry about minerals a bit.
Right. Definitely still need to be vigilant for all those reasons you just shared. Well, right before we close out, maybe just real briefly, maybe in a sentence or two each, what advice do you both have for advocates and activists today? Real quick.
Go ahead, Ralph.
Don't lose heart. Politics is going to change, and I think it's going to change big. And soon.
My advice is keep doing it the Sierra Club way. Get on the ground, know the landscape, crawl over every inch, and make sure that you're familiar with it and you can articulate the values, and just do it that way. The areas are now smaller, but what we want to do is start at the local level, maybe with county commissioners rather than more of a top-down that was used in the Frank Church River of No Return Wilderness. So like Scotchman Peak and so forth. So that's my
great
thought.
advice. Great advice. Great advice. Thank you so much. And I'm gonna help close us out here. I see that if folks can stay on mute so we don't have any background noise, that could be helpful. I'm just hearing a little bit of an echo. But Jenna, if you can go ahead and pull up our slides again to close out, that would be fantastic. So we can see our final slides here. I will say that the organizing team did decide to kind of skip over, we were running low on time and we skipped over kind of the storytelling portion of this webinar. I think we'll have to do another one when all of us can get on and just tell our stories together about our time in the Frank. And I hope that in the future, we can actually all go to the Frank together, have an outing together. Right now is not the time to do that with this pandemic, but when this is all over, as we like to say, that hopefully we can all be together in person and continue to share these stories and celebrate this beautiful, wonderful place that we have. So with that,
Lisa, if I may,
yes.
I'd like to thank both Ralph and Larry for their presentations, and especially to Edwina for reaching out to the Frank Church Institute. We had intended a grand celebration of the 40th anniversary of the Frank, beginning in April with a gala with Douglas Brinkley, who is the presidential historian who's written extensively on conservation issues with both the Roosevelts. He's very fond of Frank Church. He's writing a book about this particular legislation during the 60s and 70s, prominently featuring Frank Church. So hopefully we can bring him to Boise next year, and please watch out for that. But thank you all for organizing this.
Thank you for sharing that, Gary, for sharing that gratitude for our speakers and for lifting up those future opportunities to keep learning and celebrating this history. Yes, everyone should keep their eye out on the Frank Church Institute website and follow the great work that's happening there and future events to engage. Thank you, Gary, for saying that. So just to kind of close out here, I do want to share knowing that kind of background and some of the history on the roots of our work here at the Idaho Chapter Sierra Club, I want to share kind of what's on the horizon for our chapter here. We're working on a number of different campaigns at the moment, including building local grassroots momentum to move towns and cities across Idaho toward 100% clean energy for all commitments, like we successfully got the city of Boise to do last year. And we're working to get all of Idaho's electric utilities off of coal, which we helped move the needle on, including Idaho Power's announcement last year to be coal-free by 2030. So we're making progress, and there's still more progress to be done. And some of our current work involves advocating for more solar power in Idaho's agricultural sector, empowering student activists to push for clean school districts, and building a broad coalition to create a network of bike and pedestrian routes along interconnected canal pathways, which the city of Boise is now building a master plan around. So lots of work, lots of momentum, kind of the wind at our heels, but still lots of work to be done. And we are, in addition, working with several other partner groups and mobilizing our supporters to advocate for measures to save Idaho salmon and steelhead from the brink of extinction. And if we go to the next slide, I want to turn it over to Connor real quick to share how you can help us with this campaign. Connor, are you there? I'm hoping Connor's here. Connor, he's one of our outings leaders and one of our volunteer leaders working on salmon work.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Yes.
All right, so Idaho salmon and steelhead are in trouble. They're still on the path towards extinction. They need your help, and the best way you can help them is by convincing Idaho's gubernatorial leadership that they need to get behind salmon recovery. And we're asking everyone to please just let Governor Brad Little know they need help. And I can provide you all the estimates on why they're going extinct, but there still are, despite hatcheries, despite all these various recovery efforts. So please just sign this letter, and please email Brad Little if you can. There's a salmon work group that's also going on. It's going to be taking place on August 7th and 8th. If you would like to comment during that period, that would also be amazing. Anyways, so that's my spiel.
Thanks so much, Connor. And yes, I put that link in the chat for everyone. Please click on that right now and send a letter to the governor supporting this effort. Thank you so much. And if we can go to the next slide, I have one more message, pretty much. So let's see, here we are, great. You know, I just want to say that we cannot have big victories like the ones that we discussed tonight without community support and the people power that drive lasting change. I think we heard that a lot. We heard it from Larry and from Ralph about the people on the ground, the Sierra Club members, and supporters who help make all this happen. And we still have more work to do. So our chapter really can't function at such a high level without the support of people like you. And there are so many opportunities to get involved. You can volunteer with our campaigns and our program work. You can become a one-time or monthly donor. You can just follow us on social media and sign up for our email blast so you can help spread the word about our climate action and other conservation campaigns. So we will be sending a follow-up email with more information about how to stay engaged in this work. And I'm going to stick the link in right there for becoming a monthly donor, which, you know, if you're able to donate tonight by clicking on the link in the chat, this will help us keep up the work and be able to put on more events like these for all of us to enjoy, which I hope can continue to lift our spirits and give us inspiration and energy to keep pushing ahead amidst the uniquely challenging times that we're in right now. So in closing, I just want to thank our guests for not only joining us this evening, but for their perseverance 40 years ago to make a difference that we will continue to value for generations to come. Thank you so much, Larry and Ralph, for all that work all those years ago and for your ongoing work in this field. And thank you to all of our listeners and in the audience here, because we know that you're the kind of people who show up to make a difference, to be positive contributors to your communities and to the environment. We really hope this webinar is a reminder that those efforts are worthwhile. And we appreciate both the big and small things that all of you do who are on this webinar. And maybe 40 years from now, Sierra Club will be hosting a webinar to celebrate the great work being done by all of you on the webinar today. So thank you all for joining tonight. And that's it for tonight. So we'll say good night. Thank you, everyone.